Welcome to the second session of the Khushwant Singh Lit Fest. And this session is going to feature Mr. Jairam Ramesh. He's an Indian economist, historian, and politician belonging to the Indian National Congress. He's a member of parliament representing Karnataka state in the Rajya Sabha. He belongs to that rare breed of politicians who write not about themselves, but about others. In his case, about Rameshji's work is on Sir Edwin Arnold's published in 1879 and has remained relevant and in vogue ever since. Rameshji draws on India's literary, cultural, political, and social history to explain the poem in its context, and also provides an unusual dimension on the life of Sir Edwin Arnold, the famous British poet steeped in Sanskrit literature. This session will be conducted as a conversation with Mick Brown, a famous journalist who wrote for the Sunday Times as well as the Daily Telegraph, and whose book, fascinating title, is called Music for the Spiritual Tourist. And it combines his interest in both music and spirituality. Over to you, Mick.
Thank you so much. It's an enormous pleasure to be here today. By here, I mean I'm sitting in the offices of the Daily Telegraph because we're doing this by the wonders of the internet. But it's an enormous pleasure to be talking to Mr. Ramesh. I feel particularly pleased to be having a conversation with you, Jairam, if I may call you Jairam. I'm very excited by Sir Edwin Arnold because, as far as I know, he's the only editor of the Daily Telegraph ever to write an epic poem of the life of the Buddha, which has sold 1 million copies around the world. I think I can safely say no other editor of the Daily Telegraph has ever done that. And as a journalist for the Telegraph, that makes me feel proud by association. But this is a simply splendid, extraordinarily interesting, extraordinarily enlightening, a word which of course should be used in the context of Buddhism, extraordinarily enlightening book. And I congratulate you on it. I found it absorbing, fascinating, and just a brilliant read. It also, I think, remedies something, which is that Sir Edwin Arnold, who to my mind is one of the great Victorians, has been overlooked, really. And your book sets out to rectify that and to remedy that, which I think it does, and really brings this very eminent Victorian back into everybody's imagination, which is an extraordinary accomplishment. So what I'm really interested to know is what first alerted you to this poem, and what first alerted you to Sir Edwin Arnold, and why did you want to write a book about it?
Well, Mick, every Indian has Buddha in his or her DNA, if not Buddhism. Buddha is very much part of our lives. We are taught about Buddha in school. Buddha is all over us. Buddhist icons, iconography, Buddhist paintings, Buddhist statues. So Buddha is very much part of Indian life, as I'm sure it's part of life in other parts of the subcontinent like Sri Lanka and Nepal, particularly. And I read this poem when I was 14 years old or 15 years old, and it just remained with me. But over the years, as I'm not a Buddhist in the ritualistic or the religious sense of the term, but I'm fascinated and captivated by two particular figures in Indian history, Buddha and Ashoka, who did much to propagate Buddhism as a creed. And as I kept, reading about Buddhism and the spread of Buddhism, it just struck me how extraordinarily influential Edwin Arnold's poem of 1879 was in making the personality of the Buddha, if not Buddhism per se, the personality of the Buddha, so very popular, not only in England and Europe, not only in America, but also in Asia, including the subcontinent. And then I discovered this fascinating exchange between Winston Churchill and Jawaharlal Nehru, which takes place in 1955. And Churchill is reminding Nehru about the light of Asia. So I was just struck by how important this poem was from a cultural and literary point of view. But as I studied it more, I found its influence from a social point of view equally important. So, on the one side, Mick, you have the literary and cultural impact of this poem. But more profoundly, this poem, in its translations into many Indian languages, made Buddha the symbol of social transformation. The anti-caste movement in India, took Buddha as the icon of social protest. And all of them derived their image of Buddha and Buddha's life from the light of Asia, read not in English, but in Tamil, in Hindi, in Malayalam, in Telugu, and various Indian languages.
Yeah,
So
this is
it's a very fascinating story of a poem.
It's an extraordinary story, and I wasn't aware at all. Forgive me I wasn't aware at all of, as you say, the social implications, particularly in the subcontinent of this.
I would just say that, the English had a literary impact, the English poem in English, but its social impact came through its multiple translations.
Right. There's two things I want to ask you before we get into that, which I do want to discuss. First of all, you say you read this poem when you were 14 years of age. Well, under what circumstances? Was this on the school curriculum or something, or did you?
No. It was a poem that my father had in his bookshelf. I grew up in a Hindu family, but a very ecumenical and a very liberal Hindu family, and we had books on Buddha, we had books on the Jains. We had books on Christianity, in my father's bookshelf. I went to a convent school, so, I belong to that generation of Indians. So, I read it. It didn't strike me, but it remained with me, what I wish to say,
Yeah. First of all, could you tell our audience something about the man, Sir Edwin Arnold himself? Because to me, he's a very profoundly interesting man. In many ways, typical of his generation, typical of his era, but in other ways, completely atypical of his era. Yeah. Give us some idea of who Sir Edwin Arnold was.
Well, Mick, I depart company from my good friend and party colleague and fellow MP, Shashi Tharoor, who paints the Victorian era as an era of high imperialism, of people, who had nothing better to do, thought of nothing except subjugating a colonial people. I think the Victorian period also had a large number of personalities who, while they were committed to British rule in India, were equally captivated and fascinated by India's, and when I say India, I mean the subcontinent's cultural and spiritual and literary legacy. So you have the rediscovery of Buddhism going on. You have the epigraphical rediscovery. You have the archaeological rediscovery. You have the literary rediscovery, and there are a large number of people, Mick. And I believe that I don't think that Edwin Arnold wrote this poem sitting down in his cottage in Kent, saying, now, how do I justify Queen Victoria's rule in India? And I will produce this poem on the Buddha. So you have people like James Princip, you have people like Alexander Cunningham, you have people like Max Muller, you have, all these are Victorians who believe in Britain's manifest destiny in India. But at the same time, they are people who are learning Sanskrit, who are learning Indian languages, who are translating the ancient Indian literary texts. Edwin Arnold translated the Mahabharata, he translated the Bhagavad Gita, he translated many, very many major Indian works. And therefore, Edwin Arnold is a very, very unusual figure. He comes to India in 1857 as the mutiny, is winding down. The first war of independence, as we like to call it, and the Great Mutiny, as you like to call it. He came to
the war of independence. Come on.
He came to India. He spent 2.5 years in India as principal of a college, taught himself, learned Sanskrit, learned Marathi. started, this lifelong love affair with Indian literary classics. And of course, for 25 years, he was the leader writer of your newspaper, the Daily Telegraph, writing
Exactly.
thundering articles, against the Russians.
Hmm.
He was a great supporter of the Turks
Yes.
against the Russians.
Yeah.
He wrote great, a lot of articles he wrote on Britain's role in the world, which today might sound to be an apology for British imperialism, but in the context of the times, I would say he was a liberal imperialist. He
Yeah.
was, he was not a hardcore imperialist, but he was an imperialist who taught himself multiple languages, who was very, very sensitive to local cultures.
Hmm.
Sri Lanka, Ceylon. He went to Ceylon, of course. Even,
Hmm.
of course, he was very close to India. Became for the last 20 years of his life married a Japanese, and became a great advocate of an Anglo-Japanese alliance.
Yes.
He became a great Japan file. So Mick, he comes at a time in Victorian England when religious doubt is at its peak,
Hmm.
when Darwin has just been published, and
Hmm.
science is making great advances, when biblical orthodoxy and papal orthodoxy is under assault.
Hmm.
And he finds in Buddha, a figure, not a religious figure, but a ethical figure, a man who is propagating, basic ethical principles of what constitutes a good life.
Yes.
And I think the time was ripe
Yes.
for discovery of a personality like a Christ-like figure, so to
Right.
speak.
Right.
Minus the miracles. And therefore, I think what he did through this poem, Mick, was really bring out Buddha, the man, the Buddha, the person, the Buddha,
Hmm.
the social reformer,
Hmm.
not Buddha, the founder of a religion, which
Hmm.
later on came to be called Buddhism.
Yeah, it's very interesting what you say about the time being right, really, for the publication of this poem, because there had been at that time there was a growing interest in Buddhism, in Hinduism, in Islam. A growing interest in what we might now call comparative religion, the study of comparative religion, and that had started through people, as you say, Muller and so forth. Um, I think personally as well, reading the poem, that the way the poem is written, it's written in a very vivid, some might say florid, but very romantic way. And I could almost imagine Victorians reading this poem and reading about the life of the Buddha. I can almost imagine this being illustrated by the pre-Raphaelite painters. Holman Hunt, of course, did a poem called "The Light of the World," which is an image of Christ. And it's not too fanciful to imagine Holman Hunt having painted the light of Asia in the same sort of way. So I think the time was certainly right for Sir Edwin. But there had been Buddhist studies before. There were Buddhist academics. There were lectures in churches and so on and so forth. But why then did Arnold's poem in particular? Do you think it just crystallized that moment in a very populist sort of way?
Two things, Mick. First, before Arnold, you had scholars of Buddhism. You
Of
had
course.
Rhys Davids, you had Max Muller, you
Yeah.
had Monio Williams, then you
Hmm.
had Alexander Cunningham, who established the Archaeological Survey of India.
Yep.
Earlier, you had James Prinsep, and before James Prinsep, you had William Jones,
Yes.
who founded the Asiatic Society
Yeah.
when Warren Hastings was the Governor General. So you had Buddhist scholars,
Hmm.
both in England as well as in Germany, particularly, and
Hmm.
in France. But remember, these were Buddhist scholars. They
Hmm.
were, translating Chinese texts. They were translating Pali texts. They were translating Japanese texts. But they were scholars. They were academics. They
Hmm.
were writing for a small constituency of their peers.
Hmm.
Arnold takes all this knowledge from different sources puts it in the form of an epic poem. And the Victorian period is also the age of poetry.
Of course.
I'm struck by the fact, by the number of poets who get knighted, as
Right.
opposed to the number of authors. You don't have Sir Charles Dickens, but you have Lord
Right.
Tennyson.
Very good point.
You have Sir Edwin Arnold. So this was the age of poetry, which epitomized empire. It epitomized Britain in all its great glory. So I think what the first reason is what Arnold does. He takes the life of the Buddha out of the academic world and puts it into the popular discourse, into the public domain.
Right.
But the more important reason, Mick, why this poem went viral, to speak today's language, is because it first became a sensation across the Atlantic. It was taken up by the Transcendental movement in Boston, centered around Boston. It became a sensation in America. And once it became a sensation in America, the reverse impact was felt in England. And it then became more and more popular in England. And then it got translated into German, into French. Leo Tolstoy became interested. It got translated into Russian. So then it got a continental interest. Now, in 1885, it gets translated into Bengali.
Right.
For the first time, for the first Indian language. And that kindles a remarkable interest of the poem. In any case, it was a small, tiny elite, English-speaking elite of India who would read poems and books. And Edwin Arnold's poem, because it was a sensation in England, after it becoming a sensation in America, became popular in India. And so, and then the translations started coming out. And remember, we are now the nationalist movement is taking shape. Indians want to show their philosophical, their spiritual, and their cultural superiority to the British. We may be ruled by you, but we are, we have a greater civilization.
A tradition of our own, yes, a greater tradition. Yeah.
And Buddha becomes the epitome of this legacy, this spiritual legacy, this philosophical legacy, this cultural legacy. And so Buddha, all the great figures of Hinduism, Swami Vivekananda and Rabindranath Tagore and Mahatma Gandhi, everybody adopts Buddha as the symbol of Indian greatness, as a symbol of a person who lived in the 5th century BC, long before the Englishmen, when the popular saying, when the English were still hanging from the trees, Buddha was his message of humanity in India. So that's the second reason, Nick, why the poem becomes so very popular.
That's really interesting.
And then, of course, it keeps getting reprinted year after year after year. And also, Edwin Arnold, being the leader writer and subsequently editor of the Daily Telegraph, occupies an important position in the British establishment. He was not considered to be a great poet by any means. He was not in the Tennyson mold, for example. He was not considered to be a great poet, but because of the position that he enjoyed, and the Daily Telegraph being the preeminent newspaper, of that era, he was listened to, he was read. His opinions mattered, his opinions counted. And I think he becomes an iconic figure.
Yes.
Over a period of time, across the continent, certainly becomes an iconic figure in America and becomes a hugely iconic figure in India. I should mention here, Mick, that in 1885, Edwin Arnold translates the Bhagavad Gita into English as the song Celestial. And Gandhi, who was then a law student in London, a 20-year-old law student, becomes acquainted with the Bhagavad Gita through Edwin Arnold's translation. And it is this translation that Gandhi keeps quoting from till his very last day He's assassinated. And till his very last day, he is quoting from Edwin Arnold's translation of the Bhagavad Gita. So he becomes an iconic figure because of that.
And of course, Gandhi also spoke very admiringly of the light of Asia, as well as Arnold's translation of the Bhagavad Gita.
Yes, I mean, Gandhi was more the Bhagavad Gita man. As far as light of Asia and Buddha was concerned, it was Nehru. It was Nehru, it was Tagore, it was Vivekananda, and of course it was Dr. Ambedkar, later on, who becomes the architect of the Indian Constitution. They become, but in India, Mick, there are two very clear streams. There is the Gandhi, Nehru, Tagore stream, which looks at Buddha as a cultural, philosophical, ethical figure. And then there is the Ambedkar stream, which looks at Buddha as a social reformer. The Martin Luther, if you will. The man who reformed, who sets out to reform Hinduism, classical Hinduism. Particularly, he becomes the symbol of the anti-caste movement across the country.
But this is very interesting to me because, as you say, Buddha, partly through Arnold, but through these other figures you mentioned, Buddha becomes recognized or elevated as a great social exemplar, a great exemplar of humanitarianism. But Buddhism does not experience a great role. Having started in India, Buddhism is more or less extirpated from India and migrates north to Tibet, to China, south to Ceylon and Asiatic countries. Buddhism does not maintain a hold in India at all. And we see this very interestingly when later on Arnold goes back to India and visits Bodh Gaya, which is the foundation stone of Buddhism, and is absolutely dismayed by when he finds that it's in the control of a Mahant and all the Buddhist statuary has been turned into service of Hindu gods and so forth. Can you explain that dichotomy to me?
Well, Mick, Buddhism begins to decline in India around about the 6th century AD. And the first reason why it begins to decline is the Brahmins begin to appropriate Buddha as an incarnation of Vishnu, the Indian god. So, Hinduism has a remarkable capacity. Hinduism is a giant blotting paper. It absorbs everything. It assimilates everything. And the Brahmins began the process of assimilation somewhere in the 6th or the 7th century. And by the 8th century, the first inscriptions hailing Buddha as an incarnation of Vishnu begin to appear. Now, so it's a gradual decline. And by the 11th or the 12th century, when Islam begins to make its advance in the subcontinent, Buddhism as a faith, really is on its last legs. It almost vanishes in India. But as you point out, this is the period when it is really flourishing in the rest of Asia. It's flourishing in Sri Lanka, it's flourishing in Burma, Japan, China, Korea, in other parts. So it's a long period of decline. It's a period of decline that begins in the 7th century, and it really begins to vanish from the Indian subcontinent by the 12th century or thereabouts. Now, the fact is that then Buddhism is forgotten till the Britishers begin to rediscover him. William Jones in the late 18th century. James Princip is the first man who really, Charles Allen has this beautiful book called The Buddha and His Sahibs, where, Charles Allen recounts the story of the rediscovery of Buddha. James Princip reads the epigraphs which have been forgotten from Ashoka's time. Alexander Cunningham, unearths Bodh Gaya and Sarnath, which are very important places in Buddhist philosophy and Buddhist faith. And then, of course, you have people like Edwin Arnold. Bodh Gaya, you mentioned Bodh Gaya. It's very important, Mick. In fact, today's Bodh Gaya owes a huge debt to Edwin Arnold, because Edwin Arnold goes to Bodh Gaya in February of 1886 and is mortified to find the site of Buddha's enlightenment under the control of Hindu priests. And along with the Ceylonese monk activist Anagarika Dharmapala, they launch a movement for reclaiming the control of the Buddhist, the Mahabodhi temple, from the Hindu priests to be handed over to the Buddhist community. And since there is no Buddhist community in India, this is going to be a transnational Buddhist community. So this campaign starts in 1886. And this is resolved only in 1953. It takes 70 years, and it's a typical Indian solution that is found. The Mahabodhi temple control was taken from the Hindu priests and handed over to a management committee, 50% of whom would be Hindus, 50% of whom would be Buddhists. And that's the formula that exists even today. So the Mahabodhi temple is a very, it's the, everybody knows what the Ayodhya, movement was, where a mosque was demolished and now a temple is being built. But before that, we had the Bodh Gaya agitation. But the Bodh Gaya agitation ended peacefully. It ended through a process of negotiation and compromise in which people like Nehru and Gandhi and, they played a very important role. But the fact that Bodh Gaya today, the Dalai Lama, for example, preaches at Bodh Gaya when he used to, now doesn't go there, but for health reasons. But the fact that Bodh Gaya today has become sort of a Vatican for the Buddhists is a very large part due to Edwin Arnold and nobody else.
And it is. I've been very fortunate, privileged to visit there myself. It's a beautiful place, and where one can truly say the spirit of the Buddha resides in Bodh Gaya. I mean, it's a completely magical place. You must have been there yourself.
Yes, I've been there, and
did you feel moved by it?
Well, Mick, one of the things that Edwin Arnold missed out in Bodh Gaya, and I think he missed out because basically, ultimately, for all his erudition and all his love for Indian culture, the Western mind is a binary mind. You're with us or you're against us. It's black or white. The Indian mind, the subcontinental mind, admits of multiple shades of gray, multiple nuances. And what Edwin Arnold missed in Bodh Gaya was that Bodh Gaya was sacred not only to the Buddhists, but it was sacred to the Hindus and the Jains as well. The point I wish to make, which I have made in the book, is that in fact, most sacred places in India are liminal in nature. When the Hindu says, this is my sacred place, you can be rest assured that it is also sacred for the Muslims, and it may have been sacred to the Buddhists and the Jains much before the Hindus came on the scene. So this liminality of sacredness, Arnold missed. So Arnold goes to Bodh Gaya in February 1886 and writes a thundering editorial for the Daily Telegraph, a dispatch from Calcutta, where he calls Bodh Gaya the Mecca of Buddhists. Now, if it was a Mecca for Buddhists, non-Buddhists would not have been allowed in Bodh Gaya, right?
That's rather unfortunate choice of phrase, isn't it?
So, by calling it the Mecca for Buddhists, and in another place he calls it the Jerusalem for Buddhists. See, I mean, Indian religions are not like the Semitic religions. There's a lot of doubt. There is a lot of flexibility. You can be a Hindu, you can be a Buddhist, you can be a Jain. The boundary, what I'm trying to get at, the boundaries are not fixed. So he missed that aspect in Bodh Gaya, but I'm glad he did what he did, because today, for the Buddhist community, and there is a flourishing Buddhist community now in Bodh Gaya, as you would have noticed.
Yeah.
It's a very important place. It's a very serene place, actually.
I think one of the things the book does, or the poem, I should say, does, and perhaps is another factor in the way it captured the public imagination, is that it identifies a singular figure and draws, in some instances, almost a direct correlation between the Buddha and Christ. And I think this was perhaps something that
Absolutely. He wrote
could identify.
In 1891, Edwin Arnold wrote this poem called "The Light of the World," and it was on the life of Christ. And that book bombed.
Yeah,
there was no appetite for a poem on the life of the Christ. That poem bombed. But the Light of Asia, of course, became. Nobody remembers the Light of the World. Everybody remembers Light of Asia.
I think
but you're right. He was trying to draw a parallel between, the life of Christ and the life of Buddha. The only difference being that there are miracles in the life of Christ, but there are no miracles in the life of Buddha. So while Christ is a divine figure, Arnold makes Buddha out to be a human figure. And I think that's what led to the popularity of the poem. And that's what has led to the popularity of the translations as well. I think what Arnold does, in the Light of the World, he brought out the divinity of Christ. But in the Light of Asia, he brings out the humanity of Buddha. And I think by bringing out the humanity rather than the divinity, he struck a chord. In America, struck a chord in Europe, certainly in England, and he struck a chord in India.
Why do you think, and I'm just speculating wildly here, given that the poem is being published at a time where there's a growing interest in all the Asiatic religions, all of them, I mean, certainly in Hinduism and Buddhism, why was there no equivalent poem or figure or something written about Hinduism that would have captured the imagination in the same way?
Because there's no one figure, Mick.
Krishna?
There was no one figure.
Krishna?
See, remember, many of my Hindu friends will get upset if I were to say this, but Buddha is a historical figure. All the great Hindu deities are not historical deities. They're mythological figures, So there's a lot of, it sounds surreal to read the life of many of these people, of many of the gods whom we revere, including Lord Ram and so on and so forth. So Hinduism doesn't have a Buddha-like figure. Jainism has, Sikhism has, certainly Buddhism has, but Hinduism does not have a historical figure that you can relate to. And in any case, Hinduism is really a conglomeration of beliefs. So there are different traditions. Hinduism is a vast ocean into multiple traditions are converging. So to that extent, the Buddha is easier to grasp because, it's one stream. Although later on, you have Mahayana and you have Theravada and, Vajrayana, you have different Hindus. But the original Buddhist belief was a simple homogeneous belief, whereas the Hindu belief is an heterogeneous belief. And I think that's much more difficult for people to grasp, and therefore, from a popular point of view, people could relate to the Buddha much more because he was, after all, he was a historical figure.
I mean, you've talked about how this book, the enormous success it was across the world and the enormous influence it had on a multitude of different people. We shouldn't forget, should we, that it was also, at the time it was published, it was met by vehement criticism from Christian missionaries and evangelists who saw this as a menace and as a danger to Christianity. Expatiate on that a little bit.
Yes, a lot of Christian missionaries, I might say Christian missionaries mostly in America, The Anglican Church was quite okay with it.
Right.
They didn't get into apoplectic fits over this book or the poem. But certainly the American missionaries and some of the Scottish Presbyterian missionaries, in India, who were active then. Incidentally, Arnold was, while he was a great believer in British rule in India and the good that it brought, was dead against missionary activity. He was dead opposed to the missionaries. The missionaries didn't like him even in the period that he spent in Pune for 2.5 years. He raved and ranted against the missionaries. Yes, there was this attack on the poem from the missionaries who saw this, who saw the popularity of the Buddha as a direct threat. People started embracing Buddhism. People started believing in the Buddha, and the message that you could be a Christian and still be believing in the Buddha. That was a very subversive belief. And particularly in America, this became particularly after the World Parliament of Religions. If you remember, the first Parliament of Religions takes place in September of 1893 in Chicago, and it's around about that time that the popularity of the Buddha is becoming very, very evident, because the Japanese are Buddhists, the Thais are Buddhists, the Koreans are Buddhists, the Chinese were Buddhists. So the Buddha was seen to be a direct threat to the supremacy of Christ and Christianity, and therefore the poem came under attack. And I think in large part to respond to this attack, Arnold wrote this poem, Light of the World, which I mentioned to you, which really bombed, which did not take off. The Light of Asia was made into a film. It was translated into 32 languages. It was adapted for opera, and so on and so forth. So the Light of the World did not have any impact whatsoever, even though it was set in the same pattern as the Light of Asia. And I think that was a period, Mick, when really it was a period of growing disenchantment with organized religion. It was a growing. A.N. Wilson has called this period the period of the extended funeral for God. And I think the most important message that Arnold sent through the poem was Buddha was not God. Buddha was not a god. Buddha was giving you a message of doing good to people, of being self-aware. And I think that resonated with people who were wanting a figure, wanting a spiritual figure, were wanting an ethical figure, but not necessarily a religious figure.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because Arnold also, and obviously responding to the temper of the times and this growing almost conflict, one might say, between science and religion, drew attention to the fact that Buddhism was much more scientific than Christianity. And there's something that he said, which I'd like to read back to you. I mean, he talked about this close intellectual bond between Buddhism and modern science. And he wrote, when Darwin shows us life passing onward and upward through a series of constantly improving forms towards the better and the best, each individual starting in a new existence with the records of bygone good and evil stamped deep and ineffaceably from the old ones. What is this again but the Buddhist doctrine of Dharma and of karma? So this would have come as quite a shock to Christian preachers, I would imagine, and be seen as a threat that here's someone aligning the figure of the Buddha with this equally challenging notion of evolution that Darwin is proposing.
Well, when he remember that Darwin comes out just 20 years before the Light of Asia. So Darwin is very much part of the public debate in England. Part of the public debate, and Arnold, in all his public writings, his speeches, when he goes to Japan, he's a great believer in science. By the way, when he is principal of this college in Pune, between 1857 and 1860. He goes into a college where only Sanskrit and Persian is taught, and he introduces courses in mathematics, he introduces courses in astronomy, and various aspects of scientific endeavor. So, although he's a poet, I think he belongs to that generation which is deeply influenced by scientific advance in the later part of the Victorian era, and he is at pains to point out that science and Buddha are not mutually exclusive, that science and Buddha are not mutually incompatible. And I think two things that he said, which I have paraphrased in the book, which said the Buddha didn't become the Buddha by following a Buddha.
Right.
Buddha became the Buddha by following his instinct, by following a spirit of inquiry, spirit of questioning, a spirit of rejecting what was not right, which is ultimately what the scientific method is all about.
Of course.
And secondly, of course, the message that Arnold was conveying was the final message which Buddha conveys, to his disciples: be your own light. Don't follow a dogma. Don't follow, what is told to you, but be your own spirit, be your own lamp. So I think that's the sort of imagery that Arnold conjures up to show that science and Buddhism are not incompatible, and therefore it's not a great mystery to find that some of the greatest scientists of the 20th century have been great admirers of Buddha. India got its first Nobel Prize in Science in 1930. C.V. Raman, discovered the scattering of light, and he got the Nobel Prize in 1930. Okay. And in his Nobel Prize speech in Stockholm, Raman says that I have been influenced by 3 books in my life. The first book was by Euclid, which is the geometry, the Greek, who wrote the book on geometry, which all of us have read when we were in school. The second book that C.V. Raman says which influenced him most was a book by a German physicist called Helmholtz, who sort of was a great figure of physics, German physics, in the late 19th century. And the third book, Mick, which C.V. Raman, who's just got the Nobel Prize in physics, says influenced him, was The Light of Asia by Sir Edwin Arnold. And he goes on to explain why. He goes on to say that it's because through the poem I got to, I related to this personality of the Buddha, the figure of renunciation, the figure of compassion, the figure of tolerance, the figure of questioning, the figure of understanding. I mean, he goes on to explain. And I found it absolutely, mind-boggling that a man gets a Nobel Prize, goes to Stockholm and says that one of the 3 books that has influenced me most is The Light of Asia. Similarly, there was a Russian chemist who is considered to be the father of modern chemistry, Dmitry Mendeleev. We learned the periodic table of elements in chemistry, and his son goes with Tsar Nicholas II on an Asian trip, and Mendeleev, the father, presents his son with a copy of Edwin Arnold's Light of Asia in Russian, so that he can spend his time productively reading this poem. The point I want to make is that not only some of the great authors like Tagore, Kipling, and others, T.S. Eliot, but great scientists have been drawn to the life of the Buddha. And I think that's because many of them see in Buddha a non-dogmatic, non-doctrinaire figure who is ultimately telling you, be your own guide, search for your own truth, be your own experimenter, which appeals to the scientist.
Yeah, you mentioned T.S. Eliot. I was very moved by what he said. You quote him as saying, on The Light of Asia, when I meet anyone else who has read it and liked it, I feel drawn to that person. And I mean, not just Lawrence, not just T.S. Eliot, there's D.H. Lawrence. I was amused to read even that it found its way into a Hollywood adaptation of The Picture of Dorian Gray, the Oscar Wilde book.
Yeah, the picture of Dorian Gray.
Given a copy of the book by his painter friend Basil. There's these extraordinary resonances. And another one that particularly interested me was Joseph Campbell, who
Yes.
writes so wisely and beautifully about mythology and comparative religion. He's given a copy of the book, a copy of the poem, I should say. I keep saying book, I mean poem. Copy of the poem by a young woman on an ocean-going liner returning from Europe to America. And the woman is Rosalind Williams, who is traveling with Krishnamurti.
Yes.
And of course, Krishnamurti had been brought forward by Annie Besant, who in turn was an admirer of the Light of Asia. There are all these extraordinary sort of interconnections that arise out of this one poem.
Well, I'm so glad you mentioned Annie Besant, Mick. She's one person who is almost forgotten today. But there was a time when Annie Besant held not only England but India enthralled, you know. She was a remarkable figure. And one of the reasons why the Light of Asia became so popular across the world is because of the Theosophical Society. Popularized it. The Theosophical Society got it translated into languages like Swedish, Finnish, Norwegian. This was the Theosophical Society at one point of time. All the leading intellectuals of the world, the leading poets of the world, the leading scientists of the world, the leading men of letters were all Theosophists. Like once upon a time, they were all Freemasons in the 19th century. In the 20th century, Theosophy was a huge rage, Mick. And of course, people forget it. But Annie Besant plays a very, very important role in the rediscovery of Hinduism and Buddhism.
Yes.
She was president of the Indian National Congress, the party
Yep.
which I belong. She fought for India's freedom. She fell out with Gandhi later on, but she remains. Jawaharlal Nehru was a Theosophist. Nehru's father was a Theosophist. Gandhi, when he lived in London studying law, used to go to the Theosophical Society for vegetarian food. And he writes about how he got introduced to Hinduism and Buddhism thanks to the Theosophical Society. And this is a story waiting to be written. The story of Annie Besant, the story of the Theosophical Society, and of building bridges between England and in the subcontinent, as I talked about.
Well, I think maybe you're the man to write it, Jairam. That particular story. There's one. It's a story you don't mention in the book, but might interest you about these sort of extraordinary connections that are made. You do mention Alan Bennett, who was a Theosophist,
Yes.
who then became a Buddhist and became the first Englishman actually to become a Buddhist monk in Burma. And things didn't go so well for him in Burma. He was susceptible to illness, and the place that he was living, he was having a very hard time of it. And an English woman visited him there once, and decided that she needed to raise money to get him back to England. Bennett had become interested in Buddhism, as you say, by reading The Light of Asia. The person that this English woman, Mrs. Brown, approached was Channing Arnold, who was editor of a newspaper in Rangoon, and Channing Arnold arranged for Bennett to be sent back to England. So there we have another example of this wonderful kind of circularity of the influence of Sir Edwin Arnold.
I'm glad you mentioned Channing Arnold, Mick, because the last few pages of my book are devoted to the discovery of Channing Arnold's grandchildren who live in Bhopal. Channing Arnold came to Bhopal from Rangoon, married a local Muslim woman because he worked for the Nawab of Bhopal. He was murdered in 1937 over a property dispute. He had one son and one daughter. The daughter was raised as a Christian, went back to England. The son was raised as a Muslim, lived in India, and I discovered 4 grandchildren of Channing Arnold. And the one who helped me get photographs was a young man called Mohammed Michael Arnold. Mohammed Michael Arnold, who is the
Well,
grandson of Channing Arnold and the great grandson of Edwin Arnold, now living in Bhopal.
well, what a wonderful ecumenical conjunction that conjures up.
Remarkable, absolutely. I found that mind-boggling. I discovered this through the archives. I was going through the archives, wanted to know more about Channing Arnold. Then in the National Archives, I discovered something about his murder. Then I dug deep, and then it said he was drawing a pension from Bhopal. So I put two and two together, and I said, if he's drawing a pension from Bhopal, he must have worked for the royal family. So I contacted some of my friends in Bhopal, and they, one thing led to another. It was like a detective story. And then I ended up talking to Mohammed Michael Arnold, the great grandson and in fact, Channing Arnold's granddaughter, Grace Arnold, is 94 years old and lives in London right now. So
Really? She's still alive?
she's still there. She's still there. She's 94 years old, and she's still
That's
there, very much there.
So listen, I'm getting a sort of wind-up signal here on the computer, but I must encourage you to write this book about Annie Besant and the Theosophical Society.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, she's a fascinating figure, Mick. She really is a fascinating figure.
A fascinating figure.
I've always been this whole Freemason movement in the 19th century and the Theosophical movement in the 20th century. How attractive it was. To politicians, to literary personalities, to the artistic world, is a story waiting to be written. Actually,
Of course, just briefly, we mentioned theosophy. I mean, still a very, very enduring legacy of that is Olcott, and Olcott opening schools in Ceylon, Sri Lanka now, which are still flourishing. I mean, Olcott has been a very, very important figure in the Buddhist the maintenance and revival of Buddhism in Ceylon.
Well, right next to where in Chennai, where my mother-in-law, my in-laws live, they live very close to the Theosophical Society. There's an Olcott Junior School still running, named after Olcott, Henry Steele Olcott, and of course, not to forget Madame Blavatsky, who started it all.
Right. Yeah, again, another forgotten figure, but a very fascinating woman. Listen, it's been such an enormous pleasure and privilege to talk to you, Jairam. And we've corresponded a little on email, but it's been delightful to actually to meet you, if not in person, then in sort of cyber world. And I do hope we have the opportunity to meet in person.
Thank you very much, and I'm so very grateful that you agreed. There's nobody more appropriate than you. The Daily Telegraph connection. You have written about your travels in India to all these sacred places. I've read your article on where you've been to Bodh Gaya, and there's nobody better than you to understand the significance of this book.
Well, it's a magnificent book, and I love reading it. And I would commend it to everybody who is watching this. Again, thank you so much.
Thank you, Mick. Thank you very much.
We've been deeply privileged to listen to two experts, Jairam Ramesh and Mick Brown. They've been talking about Lord Buddha, but went beyond. And it was not simply a reconstruction of his life, nor even just the restoration of the reputation of Sir Edwin Arnold. It went beyond, and it went into theosophy and the need to have a book on some of the major figures in the Reformation movement, history and archaeology, and also religion. If Islam was a militant import into India, Buddhism, what is its most famous pacifist export? And it's, in a sense, sad that while Buddha himself is revered as a figure, Buddhism should have found root in the countries that surrounded India and in various parts of Southeast Asia. It's also sad that most of the monuments that we associate with the efflorescence of Buddhism are in places like Taxila and in northern Pakistan. They are still maintained, and it's a great pleasure to be able to see them. In the Lahore Museum, one of the aftermaths of 19 was that the footprints of Lord Buddha were divided. The left footprint was left in the Lahore Museum, and the right footprint was taken to the museum in Chandigarh. I hope one day there will be a time when both footprints can be seen together in a common step towards the establishment of understanding which goes beyond boundaries. So for your very sensitive, informative, and deeply moving discussion, Jairamji, I'm deeply grateful to you, and also Mick, for your highly stimulating discussion on Lord Buddha. If there was ever a time, I remember meeting Ingrid Bergman, and she was performing in London. And at the end of it, like a young student, I went to the stage door for her autograph. And I said, Madam, when I was young, I'd seen you portrayed Joan of Arc, and I came that close to becoming a Roman Catholic. And she smiled very sweetly and said, I don't believe that, but thank you for the compliment. I have come close to becoming a Buddhist, thanks to you, Jairamji.
Thank you.
And thanks for such a sensitive interpretation of a figure in our common history who has so much to teach us, even now, thousands of years after his death. Thank you so much indeed. On behalf of the Khushwant Singh Lit Fest, deeply grateful to both of you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Jazari. Thank you, Mick.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.